For those who love the paranormal, many haunted houses and locations live in your head, if not your dreams or nightmares, rent-free. Though there are many, few locations stand out amongst the crowd. This week's story is an interesting one. A property that once fostered the hopes and dreams of a young family in Kentucky was transformed into a hospital for those suffering one of the most horrific diseases in history. A property that, over its 50 years in operation, saw countless deaths numbering in the thousands, if not the reported tens of thousands. Today, it exists as a shell of its former self. But those who lost their lives within its walls might never have moved on to the afterlife, continuing to roam the building, terrifying those visitors who seek them out, and captivating the imaginations of those who know the story. I'm your host, Nick, and I want to welcome you back for a brand new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. This is chapter 45, covering the tragic history and modern haunting of the iconic Waverly Hills Sanatorium. For us to truly understand the property of Waverly Hills, we need to go back before its construction. Our story begins with Major Thomas Hercules Hays, a former Confederate officer with the Salt River Battalion of State Guards and 6th Kentucky Infantry, who served in the United States Civil War. When the war ended, Thomas returned home, settling into his new life of peace with his wife Sarah, a wife whom he had only met when the war broke out, and the couple's daughters, named Lucinda and Emma. Within only a year of his return, Thomas had to say goodbye to Sarah, whom he had been married to since 1861. Sarah passed away from illness, leaving only Thomas to raise their 2 daughters. He went on to have a successful life in many different ventures, but was notably successful in railroad development. A few years after Sarah passed, Thomas was forced to bury Emma as well, passing away at only the age of 4. In 1869, he remarried to a woman named Georgia Broughton. Together, Thomas and Georgia had several children over the next 12 years. They were Katty, Georgia, Willie, Sarah, and Percy. Working his way through railroading, Thomas eventually became well known in the Kentucky political scene, having become a state senator, and he was, by all accounts, extremely well off financially. All of this time in post-war America, and the hustle and bustle that came with it, made Thomas long for simpler times and a quieter life. Thus, in 1883, he decided to follow that dream and raise his family in that kind of situation. Thomas first purchased land in Jefferson County, Kentucky, on which he established the family's home and farm. Now the Hays farm was said to be beautiful, set within the hills near the mighty Ohio River, and it was relatively close to the city for amenities, as it was only 10 miles from the city of Louisville. This was everything Thomas dreamed of, and the family thrived. There was only one thing missing, however: a school. Somewhere his children could get a proper education, as the nearest schoolhouse was 4 miles away from the Hays farm. Fortunately for Thomas, across the road from the bottom of the hill the farm was on was a 1-room building. As it wasn't occupied, he spoke to his neighbor, who owned the property, and obtained consent to use it as a schoolhouse, provided he share it with other neighboring farms in the area. It was shortly before creation of the schoolhouse that a schoolteacher had recently moved to town, a young woman by the name of Elizabeth Lee Harris. who often went by Lizzie. So the pair founded the schoolhouse on Page's Lane with Mrs. Harris as its teacher. Lizzie boarded with the Hays family and taught at the school near every day. When classes weren't in session, she could often be found sitting on the family porch, engrossed in the works of Sir Walter Scott. Lizzie loved her little schoolhouse, and when reading, she often found her gaze wandering from the pages of her books to the little schoolhouse across the road, when she came up with an idea. After obtaining permission from Thomas, Lizzie named the schoolhouse the Waverly School, after Scott's famous novel series. This couldn't have made Lizzie any more proud, as the two things she loved most in the world were now tied together. In turn, and after a short while, Thomas Hays renamed his property that he owned Waverly Hill. He especially liked this because the surrounding areas quite literally looked like waving hills. It's also unknown when the second E was dropped from the Waverly name, but since it has always ended in LY, although until it was dropped, the two versions of Waverly were used interchangeably. In likely the only tragedy during their time on the farm, the Hayes' daughter Caddy passed away and was buried on the 29th of September in 1901. Slowly but surely, time crept on, and Thomas entered the twilight of his life. His children had grown and married and moved away. Almost no farming was being done on the land by that point, and the colorful land that once held beautiful promises, and his growing family was fast becoming a memory. Elsewhere in Kentucky, folks weren't living the idyllic and peaceful life the Hays family was. At this point in history, the state, like many other locations in the United States, was facing an epidemic. Tuberculosis, the so-called White Plague, was running rampant, spurred on by the warm, humid climate of Kentucky, which made it the ideal breeding ground for the disease. The disease was airborne, and when the bacteria entered an infected person, it slowly ate away at and deteriorated the inside of a person's lung tissue. By the turn of the 20th century, tuberculosis was responsible for 1/4 of all deaths in the United States. Of all the states and cities affected by it, Kentucky had the highest death rate in the entire country. Experts attribute this to the beginning stages of industrialism and geographic location. The location was also perfect, as the Ohio Valley didn't get as much fresh airflow as it should have. In 1906, the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital was established to combat the growing epidemic. The state's normal hospitals were overcrowded, and the board was charged with finding new places to house TB patients. Their search eventually led them to Thomas Hays' property. It was perfect for several reasons. First was that there was a great amount of standoff distance from the city of Louisville. It was picturesque in nature, to bring calm to the patients and attract new staff. And the farm was set high in the Waverly Hills, so it offered a good flow of air that those around the city and in the valley just didn't get. Thomas Hays was approached by the board to see if he'd be willing to sell his farm. In 1908, he agreed to do so. He left Waverly Hills for the last time before his passing on the 9th of November in 1909. For those who are interested in visiting him and the rest of the family, Thomas Hays was buried in the Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville. Unfortunately, I can't tell you any more about what happened to Lizzie Harris, but I'm assuming that as the children left and married off, she would have done the same, and moved on to a new stage of her career. Thomas's wife Georgia survived him and never remarried. She passed away in 1934 and is buried in the Hays plot at Cave Hill. The board broke ground on construction of the first hospital in 1908 and eventually opened the 2-story temporary sanatorium in 1910. The original construction consisted of an administrative and main building and then 2 open-air pavilions, each of which could house up to 20 patients. These wings were also meant to catch those with early cases of TB. The following year, the city of Louisville began to draw up plans for the creation of a new city hospital. This hospital was set to administer and treat patients of the non-TB infected variety. To fulfill the growing needs, the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital was granted another $25,000 to build a hospital specifically for those advanced cases, as well as those TB cases that were considered pulmonary. By the end of August in 1912, every patient that was infected with TB was moved to Waverly Hills. Many of these patients had to be housed on the grounds outside the main building and were put up in tents. Only months later, that December, the construction on the advanced hospital was completed and could take 40 new patients. A further expansion was built in 1914 and was labeled a children's pavilion, adding a further capacity of 50. This was meant to house both children infected with TB as well as the children of parents infected with TB who couldn't or had no one to look after themselves. The goal of the hospital was continued expansion, seeing a new building added each year to further meet the growing demand. As the disease continued to mutate, it became evident that a much larger location was needed to house the continually growing demand for treatment. There was a grant of $1 million voted on to expand the hospital and meet that demand. The desired cost of each bed space was to be around $3,625. The construction of a new hospital was started in 1924. The 180,000 square foot building of brick and concrete that we see today was designed by Kentucky architect Dennis Xavier Murphy and was opened on the 17th of October in 1926, retaining the name Waverly Hills, and was placed in the care of Superintendent Oscar Miller. This new building could house up to 400 patients, and I can't stress enough how modern and state-of-the-art this new facility was considered at the time. It was the most advanced TB treatment facility anywhere in the United States. Even with the new technology and treatments they had, the hospital couldn't save the majority of their patients. As in 1926, there was still no antibacterial agent to cure TB, so only the reverence the staff could offer was really lots of rest, fresh air, and the most nutritious food they could get. Patients were mainly given relief by way of heat lamps and positive talk. It seemed to help in whatever capacity it could, keeping the hospital's death rate, at its highest point, around 1 patient per day. Now I'll say the hospital was more hospice care than an actual hospital, a place to keep those who had contracted the disease away from those who hadn't. The state took such a hard line on keeping those who contracted the disease separate from those who hadn't, so families were often separated and unable to see each other. What I also want to draw attention to here is that anyone who came here to work, nurses, doctors, and support staff, once they had arrived at Waverly, weren't allowed to leave, no matter how well they felt. The hospital was under the most extreme quarantine protocol, and those who were employed there were meant to, let's say, live on a little island of their own. They were paid decently well for the time. The hospital's nurses saw a monthly wage of $71.50, or around $1,350 by today's exchange. To those of you saying that's not much, you need to take account they were also given free room and board, meals, laundry, and had their uniforms provided to them. Janitors got around $85 a month, while telephone operators, who worked 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, and only got 1 day off per month, made $80. The cost to house each patient was around $5.19 per day, or $97 by modern standards. Now, to give you an idea of how big this institution was, and how self-sustaining it was, I'll name you a couple of things that were on each floor. The first floor contained the entryway and lobby, solarium, patient rooms, offices, labs, an x-ray room, the salon and barber shop, a dentist, cold storage, the library, the morgue, which was only used to conduct autopsies, and maintenance offices. In the patients' rooms, each of their beds were equipped with a headphone jack so they could listen to the radio, and those who could do things like working without injury were able to learn things in the workshop, like rug weaving, toy making, wood carving, copper hammering, and leather cutting. Women could also take lessons in needlework and embroidery. The second floor contained the kitchen, bakery, dining rooms, a minor surgery room, solarium, chapel, and 2 nurses' stations. The kitchen required a heavy amount of supplies, going through, in one meal, 140 pounds of bacon, 100 dozen eggs, 30 pounds of cottage cheese, 30 gallons of ice cream, 9 gallons of syrup, 190 pounds of liver. Yearly, it also consumed 1,147 barrels of milk, 13 tons of sugar, 6 tons of butter, and 52,276 pounds of ground beef. It served, on average, 2,100 meals every day. The third floor had a minor surgery and treatment room, solarium, 2 nurses' stations, and it housed occupational therapy. The fourth was roughly the same as the second and third, but included the rooms for major surgery. The top floor was home to the heliotherapy department, access to the elevator maintenance shaft in the bell tower, and a rooftop swing set for children. The only other area in the building is the basement, which was mainly crawl spaces for piping, lower elevator maintenance access, laundry access, and a room that remains unidentified, but was built with a fire door and fans to circulate air, strangely, with low-lying tables that line the walls of the room. The most interesting feature in the hospital, and those who know the story of Waverly Hills can already point it out, is the iconic 500-foot-long tunnel that ran from the north wing of the first floor and terminated at the bottom of the hill. The item that had the largest impact on patient morale was seeing the dead bodies of other patients being transported through the facility. Thus, why the tunnel was important, to make the disposal process as discreet as possible. In the tunnel were 2 different sides. The stairs on one side were used for the workers, while the other had a mechanical cart that moved up and down to transport both supplies and bodies and anything else you can name that would have to go in and out of the facility. At the bottom, the bodies would meet up with hearses, which would take them away. I do want to clarify that the body tunnel or death tunnel wasn't a slide. Each was transported there by the mechanical cart. It also had an alternative purpose, should it ever have been required. It was to serve as an air raid shelter in the event the U.S. was ever attacked in World War II. It had enough room to fit the entire populace of the property inside, should it ever be called upon to do so. Outside the main facility were a myriad of other buildings, such as the African American Hospital, nurses' dormitories, housing for interns, private residences for doctors, the generator building, the garage, the workshop, the steam and heater plant, the water treatment station, a men's and children's pavilion, radio station, the school for children, which they attended 4.5 hours per day, an outdoor playground, and the laundry facility, which again could be accessed through the basement. There was also a morgue and crematorium that belonged to the property, but were off-site. So I've told you up to this point some of the more comforting ways that TB was treated at the hospital. But what about those that weren't so kind, or humane, or might be downright barbaric? As medical science wasn't as advanced in the 1920s as it is now, some of the treatments could be chalked up to experimentation. On the lighter end, patients were brought to areas known as sunrooms, or solariums. The staff used artificial, ultraviolet light in place of the sunlight but might often bring patients out in front of large windows or out into the open air, no matter the weather or the time of the year. This was a medical procedure known as heliotherapy, or more commonly, sunbathing. This was used because the sun's ultraviolet light effects were able to kill bacteria that cause TB. Some photographs of Waverly even show patients in lounging chairs in the winter covered in snow. For the more violent treatment methods, doctors, through the implementation of an artificial pneumothorax, attempted to deflate lungs in attempts to get the organs to rest. Others might have a balloon surgically implanted in the lungs and then expanded to open the organ up. You can imagine the devastating effects this had on human bodies that were subject to this treatment. Alternative methods for this, for patients who couldn't have it done, was to lay them on the affected side and restrict the lungs' outward movement, giving it partial rest. Other invasive methods included the lobectomy and pneumonectomy, surgical procedures that removed infected parts of the lung. Or, if patients were too far gone, entire lungs were removed altogether. There was also the phrenicotomy, or as it was better known, the phrenic nerve crush, which was used to raise a diaphragm higher into the chest, effectively disabling a lung in an attempt to let it rest and get to heal. The most brutal method was known as thoracoplasty, which was the removal of muscles and ribs, sometimes up to 7, that were removed, to allow the patient's lungs and chest to expand further and allow more oxygen in. This is viewed as a final procedure, as many patients didn't survive it. If patients were fortunate enough to survive, they were allowed to leave through the front door. Those who didn't, of course, had their ticket punched for a trip down the body chute. I also want to clear up misconceptions surrounding Waverly Hills. It's often reported that near 50,000 people lost their lives here during its years of operation. However, we know from the words of Dr. Frank Stewart, an assistant medical doctor working at Waverly Hills while it was in operation, that the highest yearly death total for the hospital never exceeded 152. So the death total at Waverly Hills sits somewhere in the amount of about 6,000 to 8,500 by the time it closed its doors. Still, no small number unto itself. During the 1930s, the numbers of new cases of tuberculosis began to decline, and in 1944, with the discovery of the antibiotic streptomycin, medical staff worldwide finally had a weapon to use against the disease. Albert Schatz, a grad student from Rutgers University, is the individual credited with its discovery. As a result, fewer and fewer new cases were popping up. Thus, the cases and number of inpatients rapidly declined within Waverly Hospital. There was a slight resurgence in the disease following the culmination of the Second World War, as soldiers returned home to the continental United States from abroad. There was another medical milestone worth mentioning from 1943, as on the 21st of January, the chief engineer, William Jordan, finished the construction of his portable X-ray machine, which he had worked on for 3 years. This was the first of its kind to be used in Louisville. Because of the rapidly declining number of cases, and the antibiotic keeping a stranglehold on new TB cases, the hospital formally closed its doors in June of 1961. Those patients who were deemed well enough were discharged and sent home, while those still undergoing treatments were transferred to the nearby, but much smaller, Hazelwood Treatment Center. For the first time since 1883, when Thomas Hays purchased the land, Waverly Hill fell into silence. Only a year later, in 1962, the building opened again with a new purpose. The newly minted Woodhaven Geriatric Center was open to patients with various stages of Alzheimer's, dementia, those who had severe mobility limits, and finally, and excuse the archaic expression here, those who were severely retarded. The Woodhaven facility hired a full staff of its own, and operated for 20 years. So what exactly caused the facility to close? Well, Woodhaven was shut by the state of Kentucky in 1982 after it discovered a number of violations that surrounded patient care, abuse, and neglect. There were also reports that the facility was using electroshock therapy on its patients. Whether to cure them or experiment on them, I don't know. Over the years, Woodhaven suffered from a decreasing budget, resultant staff layoffs, leaving those still there with the inability to care for as many patients as they had, and that's where your reported neglect violations come from. The Waverly property was shut for a year again before it was purchased by developer Clifford Todd in 1983 for the sum of $3,005,000. His intent was to convert it into a minimum security state prison, a plan that was met with fierce protest from those in the neighboring homes, and was quickly dismissed. The alternative idea was to convert the main building into apartments, but they would need Jefferson County to purchase around $400,000 worth of land from them so that they could actually start the new construction. Neither of their plans materialized, and the property again changed hands in 1996. Robert Alberhasky had plans for the property that were really only to make use of the land, rather than repurpose the Waverly Hills facility. He was part of an organization known as Christ the Redeemer Foundation, and intended to erect the world's tallest statue of Jesus on the top of the building. The statue was intended to rival that of the same name in Rio de Janeiro. He had grand plans for the 150 by 150 foot statue and accompanying buildings, such as converting some to a chapel, a theater, a faith building, and a gift shop. All in all, this was to cost around $12 million. Unfortunately for Alberhasky, donations fell extremely short of raising the required capital, and we're talking extremely short, to the sum of only $3,000 being raised in the first year of fundraising. His project was scrapped altogether in December of 1997. In the years preceding its next purchase, rumors began to abound, and stories from locals were told. There were reports of phantom hearses driving by to drop off coffins in the dead of the night. Strange noises came from the facility, and sightings of children were seen, who would vanish into thin air. Then came the reports of lights on in the building at all hours of the night, when the electricity had been cut off since 1982. It also became a shelter for the homeless and squatters. There were also reports of people sneaking into the building and hosting all sorts of black and satanic rituals within the walls. But did they ever summon or awaken anything there? Well, I'll get to that. The next and final buyers of the facility came in 2001, when it was purchased by Tina and Charlie Mattingly. Wanting to initially restore the property for a hotel project, the Mattinglys set out to raise the funds required, and although it still hadn't neared completion, some of the facility was renovated, but much of it retained the old century charm that it always had. In years long since, the Mattinglys still have dreams of turning it into a hotel, but now allow guests to visit the grounds and take paid tours of the building and conduct investigations, all in an effort to raise the funds required to make it a true tourist hotel destination. So investigations into what, you might ask? Well, there's a reason the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, as it's now known, is called one of, if not the, most haunted location in all of the United States. It's quite clear when we look at the history of the building that it's been surrounded by death. From the very beginning, it experienced around one death per day, and by its closure, death tolls that numbered in the thousands. And that's a lot of death to happen at one sole location, especially in one building. When you pair that with all of the residual negative energy and emotional and spiritual energy that's inside and was inside those walls. Pain, sorrow, anger, frustration, sadness. It's no wonder that Waverly Hills is a breeding ground for not only restless spirits of the dead, but much darker things that have been at work in the halls of the old hospital and have frightened both tourists and investigative teams all the same. There's no better opportunity to experience it for yourself than to join the Mattingleys on one of their tours or investigations. But for those who can't, I'll tell you about some of the paranormal, if not possible demonic activity that plagues the sanatorium to this day. The one thing I'll start with is that if you plan on investigating, to remember that you're not ghost hunters. You're not scariest places on earth. Enjoy your time taking pictures and attempting EVP. But don't feel as though you have to scour and get every camera angle of the place. Take some time to leave your equipment and your phones away and experience all the fright and terror that Waverly Hills has to offer. The floating orbs that move about its halls, the strange lights that move around the building at night, its unexplained falling objects and strange noises which emanate from locations where there is no earthly soul. As you make your way in the door and head to the north wing on the first floor, you'll come upon the body chute, or death tunnel. However you want to refer it is up to you. A great amount of paranormal happenings and energy are centered around this tunnel. Quite believable when you factor in some 6,000 to 8,000 bodies were transported through there in the hospital's history. And I want to reiterate again that this should be around the correct death total from the Waverly Hills Hospital, not some 50 or 60,000. The reports at the height again said the highest yearly total was 152. Somewhere along the way, whether it's because of the loss of old records or the destruction of records, that the death total was around 1 per hour. That was factually contradicted by Dr. Stewart's biography. This is a true case of history versus Hollywood. But the rumors might have served a purpose, as a higher, vastly exaggerated death toll would have made it appear to the state that more and more funds and staff were required to keep the hospital operational. Although there are the presence of orbs and disembodied spirits that are quite often associated with the tunnel, many have reported that it gives visitors a feeling of calm, likely energy from spirits that found peace in death, having finally been alleviated from suffering. Others claim to have felt a feeling of pure evil. I suppose it all depends on who's with you in the tunnel, or what is. As you make your way through the halls and staircases of Waverly Hills, you might also come across many of the more famous ghosts of the sanatorium, such as the young girl who runs across the solarium on the 3rd floor, or the ghost of a woman with bleeding wrists who cries out for help from others. The woman with the cut wrists has also been seen running out of the front door screaming, "Help me, somebody save me," before she vanishes. There is also the ghost of a man in a white lab coat who walks about the kitchen, and with him follows the smell of freshly cooked food, mostly bread. The kitchen and cafeteria are quite derelict now, but the footsteps can still be heard, as well as the opening and closing of doors under their own power. There also exists the iconic photograph of the blonde woman that's shown throughout many of the Waverly Hills tours. 2 visitors taking a selfie during their time at Waverly saw something strange in the background when it was developed they couldn't explain. Between them stood a woman, as clear as day with blonde hair, looking at the camera. During their time taking the picture, there was no one behind them, and no windows or mirrors were present at the time, so the explanation of it being a reflection can't be of use here. I'll put the picture in the accompanying Facebook blog post for when the episode releases. Another ghost is said to be near 7 feet tall and roams the building. When it's encountered by those who witness it, it has no eyes. I want to note here as well that although it might seem silly at first glance, there's a reasonable explanation for all of it. All of the spirits that have physically manifested in a recognizable human-esque form are all white and Caucasian. The reason behind this is that all patients of color were housed in an outbuilding built specifically for them. When the facility closed the first time, the colored building, for lack of a better term, was torn down. Of all the legends and stories of the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, the one that's perhaps most well known is that of room 502. There are historical reports here that those observing it have seen many shadows and shapes moving about the room, and heard the disembodied voices and screams within. If you believe the stories about 502, you'll also believe that, in the in-between years, several people also jumped to their deaths from that window. The legends also say that the 5th floor was home to those TB patients who were mentally ill, which it wasn't. All patients were free to move about, on their very own, on every floor. The 5th floor was just allowed for patients undergoing heliotherapy, so they could get that treatment to a greater extent. The believed reason why room 502 has so much paranormal activity is because in 2 years after the hospital opened, 1928, a 29-year-old nurse named Mary Hillenberg hung herself from a light fixture and died in that room. Her cause of death could be attributed to mostly depression and anxiety, as Mary was unmarried, pregnant, and quite possibly is believed to have contracted TB herself. Not knowing what to do or where to turn, she chose to end her life. Now with this story there's also an alternative one about what happened to Mary. It might be believed that one of the doctors might have been the one to get her pregnant. When she brought it forward to him, he attempted to perform an abortion that was unsuccessful and led to her death. As the unmarried pregnancy, if it ever got out, was considered scandalous at this time, the doctor might have staged the suicide to cover everything up. It's a fascinating story, although purely speculative, as nothing exists to be able to confirm it. It's unknown, because of all the lost and destroyed records, how long she was likely swinging there before she was found. Many have claimed to feel the strange sensation of wanting to jump from that window in the room while visiting. Which leads me to my next point. Another nurse who worked at the 5th floor nurses' station and frequently with the patient in 502 jumped from the patio of the roof and fell to her death only a few years after Mary. The cause of why she did that is unknown, but the popular theory is that she was pushed. I do want to confirm that her being pushed is nothing more than a theory, again, as the records are mostly gone. Even some of the Mattingly's renovation crews that worked in the building throughout the earlier stages of the 2000s were victims of the restless spirits of Waverly. They confirmed many of the facts I've already mentioned, the presence of disembodied sounds, slamming doors, and seeing lights appear when no staff were present. They were also victims of having objects thrown at them, being struck by unseen hands, and having witnessed apparitions in doorways and corridors. One of the lighter stories that often comes out of Waverly Hills is that of a boy that's been given the name Timmy. Timmy will often wander throughout the facility, rolling a ball down the hallways or towards any investigators that might be present. He's not malicious in these things going on, but merely wants to play with whomever might roll the ball back. Another young spirit named Mary is also playful and will play with the balls rolled to them like Timmy. Infrequently, guests have reported hearing children singing and have been able to make out a rendition of Ring Around the Rosie. Appropriate, when you consider they're singing it from a time when the White Plague gripped the United States, and the song was first created to describe the Black Plague in other parts of the world. Keeping on with the third-floor apparitions, it's known that during the time of closure, a homeless man and his dog fell down the elevator shaft in the building, and still appear to some guests who investigate the grounds. Now let's turn a little darker as we keep progressing through the building. If you're walking about on the 4th floor, it's said to keep a constant vigil and awareness for what's happening behind you. Quite frequently, those investigating are charged at by unknown footsteps at incredible, rapid speeds. As you turn around, of course, there's nothing. The 4th floor is an area that's reported to have a different, heavier, darker energy than the rest of the building. I personally wonder if it's because this is where the major surgeries were held. Between the negative, emotional energy and the amount of people who would have died on the operating tables there, it's no wonder that it's home to some of the most negative energy in the entire building. Here, visitors have reported seeing an entity known as a doppelganger, something that takes on the appearance of those who are alive to torment the living. A doppelganger is able to walk around and blend in with humans. It has quite often been noticed on the floors, and in many European cultures, to encounter a doppelganger is to mean quick death, although none have reported dying after seeing the one in Waverly Hills. Outside of the spirits making noises and chasing you and telling you to get out, there is one of a much darker and malevolent nature. I'll tell you about the entity that has been described only as a creature and given the name the Creeper. This entity is some form of dark shadow with impossibly twisted arms and legs that, when encountered, bring with it an unending sense of dread and feelings of doom and despair. It's usually encountered on the upper floors and crawls its way along the floors, up the walls, and across the ceilings. Many theories abound about what the Creeper might actually be. The first is that it's inhuman. I'm hesitant to use the phrase demonic here, but it brings with it a terrible aura. It's quite likely just a dark machination feeding off of the energy of the other spirits in the building. Another has it that the Creeper is a human spirit, but with the way it presents itself and the spiritual energy it gives off, the Creeper isn't likely to have ever been a human. Just about the only reason we could chalk it up to being demonic is that those entities are believed to be attracted to places where there's a great amount of residual spiritual energy and a history of often negative emotion and feeling. I don't think we'll ever quite understand what it is, but it hasn't stopped those from visiting Waverly Hills from having encounters with the Creeper. Some even had it crawl up to them and terrify them. Those who are fortunate, or unfortunate, however you want to view it, to have an encounter with the entity, quite frequently have to excuse themselves from the property, and it usually takes them hours to calm down. If you dare, you can visit the Waverly Hills Sanatorium today. There are a myriad of options that range from 2-hour tours to longer public investigatory tours, and even, if you have the desire, an option for a private overnight investigation. The walls of Waverly Hills tell an intricate and interesting story packed full of emotion. The spiritual energy here is residual. It was once a farm built on the hopes and dreams of Thomas and Georgia Hays. It became a refuge for those infected with tuberculosis, and finally a home for the mentally ill. The transition of spiritual energy from happy, peaceful, and content to sadness, agonizing, and horrific is clear to be seen in the history of the property. Now, The Waverly Hills Sanatorium is home to spirits and entities, those who still linger from tragic times of a bygone era and that which feeds off of them and might never have walked the earth. The building is a part of our history, and as humans, it's from that history that we can discern why the halls of Waverly Hills are rife with emotional, spiritual energy. So if you're inclined, take a trip down to Louisville, Kentucky, and walk the halls of the infamous sanatorium for yourself. Who knows? It might open your eyes to the other side of the veil as you walk through its tragic history on the invitation of that which waits in the dark. With this, we bring to close our story about one of the most haunted buildings in the United States, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium of Louisville. If you've ever visited Waverly Hills, or if you'd like to in the future, send the podcast an email and let me know about your own experiences. Before you go, I'd really appreciate if you can give this episode a thumbs up and share it with a friend. If you'd like to hear more amazing stories to come, ensure you hit that subscribe or follow button. The podcast is available on every major podcast app as well as YouTube, and our entire catalog is available for you to listen to now. New episodes of the Insidious Agenda podcast release every Tuesday at midnight Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. As always, I've been your host, Nick, and I want to thank you for listening to this story. I'll see you again next week.